Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Home Video Library. I'm your host Nathan P. Butler, and this time we're not actually looking at any specific products whatsoever. This video is to commemorate the fact that as of August 2023, we are hitting the 10th anniversary of this series. So with as many people as follow this that I speak to, it's not, a ton compared to many channels out there covering more mainstream stuff, but for a little niche type of program like this, I want to take a moment and sort of, kind of think back on the last 10 years, give some thoughts on sort of where things stand right now, and really just kind of commemorate the fact that we are here hitting the 10th anniversary. The first episode of the series was recorded on August 17, 2013, and then the first episode was actually released on August 18th of 2013. A lot has changed since then, quite frankly. It's been a crazy 10 years, obviously out in the world around us, of course, but for me personally, just kind of outside of Star Wars stuff, at the time that the series started, my wife and I had been married for 2 months. We just passed the 10-year mark recently. We lived in a little 2-bedroom apartment. Now we live in our house here. And of course, the biggest change was the fact that we were, just the two of us for a while there. But then as of 2018, we now have a child. So we have our son Cade running around here who is about to turn 5. So those are all huge changes. Professionally for me, I went from still teaching in a brick and mortar school as of the time of the first episodes of this series to now having taught full-time online since January of 2015. All kinds of different duties and things I've done from there. I was never considering things like teaching summer school back then, but now that's sort of like the norm for me at this point, as part of that whole teaching online process and all that. Definitely grayer, I would say. I think we're at the point now where the gray has taken over more than any of the dark color has anymore. Not as scrawny as I used to be. I want to say that between COVID and us having our son, it's like the baby weight stayed with me somehow, because I'm not that scrawny little guy that started the show. I have given up on the facial hair that just made me look more like I came from the mirror universe more so than, looked cool ever. And I guess in fandom, outside of the home video stuff, a lot has changed for me. I had been doing the Star Wars Timeline project, Star Wars Timeline Gold, from 97 up through when it shut down in 2018. And what that meant for me, basically, was that at the time that this series started, I was still doing that on a regular basis with these annual releases of massive amounts of information, working on that alongside everything else. From the Star Wars Library was still going at the time, because the reboot hadn't happened yet and turned that whole concept into a lightning rod. I was still podcasting. I had started podcasting in 2002, didn't wrap that up until 2020. So at the time that this was going, I was still doing the podcasting and whatnot. I've sort of shrunk, I don't know why I say it's sort of twice, sort of shrunk down my fandom efforts right now, mainly because of, obligations for work and being a dad and that sort of thing, especially a working and stay-at-home dad at the exact same time. Work from home and stay at home. That's a lot of stuff going on a daily basis here. And yeah, just, I've sort of rolled it back. The Patreon had started a while later, I would say, back in 2017, and the Patreon has sort of run its course as well. And my thanks to all those who are supporters over there. That was a big help, kind of especially as that was getting going and whatnot. So, kind of all the stuff outside of the home video stuff has been big for me. I had reached a point, the origin of the series was that I had reached a point where I had been collecting Star Wars books and comics and all these official stories, mainly to use as I was doing the Star Wars Timeline Gold eventually. But I was collecting them from about 1992 onward. I started with Dark Force Rising being in hardback and some of the latter issues of Dark Empire. Went back and picked up the earlier issues of Dark Empire, picked up Heir to the Empire initially in paperback, and just kind of ran with it for all that time. And because I had started so early, I was able to amass this huge collection of Star Wars books and comics, so that I basically had all the stuff, at least one copy of pretty much all the stuff that was out there, except for the stuff that I purposely ignored, like little kid reader books or the RPG stuff and whatnot, unless they were sending me copies to review and things like that. And I had got to a point where the collecting had stopped really being terribly fun, because it was literally just a matter of buying new stuff as it came out and pre-ordering it. And for anything else, a lot of it came down to, well, why don't I just, replace copies I already have with signed copies and stuff like that. The thrill of the hunt in a lot of ways was gone. And I was looking to expand what I would collect and what I would showcase on YouTube. And I said, I look at my shelves at the time, which were very, very small, relatively speaking. Hey, I've got quite a bit. Boy, was I naive and ignorant. I have quite a bit of Star Wars home video releases already. Why don't I make that my next collecting focus? And as I've talked about before, that was essentially the Wile E. Coyote moment of already going off the cliff, not realizing until you're already hanging in the air that you look down and see how deep this actually goes, and having the choice to scramble back to the cliff or simply fall. And I chose to fall and take the plunge here into this form of collecting that's way more expansive than I ever realized that it was at the time. And out of that came this series talking about this stuff and the impetus to get more, to be able to show more, and a growing realization over time that there really just weren't a lot of resources for this type of Star Wars collecting. If you want to collect Star Wars action figures and other memorabilia, tons of books out there. Jeffrey Todd Carlton has his Star Wars Super Collector's Wish book, to which I contributed an article in, I think, the 3rd or 4th edition way back when. And so you've got plenty of guides for that sort of thing. There's all kinds of collecting groups around that and variants of action figures, but you really didn't have much in the way of guides for Star Wars home video stuff. You had a few out there that weren't terribly comprehensive. It was more just showcasing individual collections, like, say, SWOnvideo.com. I still, by the way, would love to thank the person behind SWOnvideo.com by name for the help that they gave to me early in collecting, just by having that site in existence, and it's still out there at this point. But I have yet to be able to figure out the actual name of the person behind it, because the Who Is listings aren't fully public in that regard, and the only instance of seeing a name that I can find on the website is sort of a signature that I cannot read. So if you know who is behind that, or you are the person who's behind that, I would love to have heard from you, or to hear from you, because it really was an early step in helping me collect what I began collecting in mass here. Of course, eventually, the fact that there just weren't a lot of resources out there for collectors of this type of stuff would wind up leading me to seeking out other people who are knowledgeable through initially comments and whatnot for people who happen to watch these videos as the channel was growing and the series was growing. Eventually taking part in Justin Berger's Star Wars Home Video group on Facebook, of which I eventually became a moderator, again with like-minded collectors out there. Very positive experience, still a very positive community over there. And then eventually decided, after people who had asked me repeatedly about this, decided to write a saga on home video about it. At that point, I had written for Star Wars Tales back in 2004. I'd had, the figures released later on based on it through Hasbro and all that. That had given me this sort of confidence to do some self-published works early on through Lulu Press, which was Greater Good and Echoes. And then eventually got brought in to do some writing for the Wars franchise, now known as War Song, which is now being reissued through Arcbeetle Press. And just slowly but surely getting this sense of I actually could do some writing outside of my regular day job, and there might actually be people who are interested in reading it, not in massive numbers, but certainly some people might be interested in reading it. And my experiences with that, and the idea of self-publishing, and my experiences with some publishers, both good and bad, led me to say, you know what? I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do this entirely myself through what was then called Create Space. Now it's called Kindle Direct Publishing, which led to the first edition of a saga on home video back in the first half of 2017. Basically, my first attempt at this kind of guide, grayscale images, primarily taken on a table in our living room. basically, just laying stuff out there. A lot of good information and whatnot, but sort of a first stab at this concept. And over time, as I found more items, found more things of interest, more new releases came out, there was thought, well, would you ever do some type of updated version of this? And eventually I said, sure, but if I did that, I would address the one thing that most people were worried about, or not worried about, complaining about, but the first one, which is, boy, I wish the images were in color. Which eventually led me to start work on what was supposed to be a single volume second edition, just a little bigger than this. Obviously, things changed over time, and it wound up becoming a 3-volume second edition of a saga on home video, with different artwork. This artwork inspired by Brian Snook's suggestion of doing something sort of cassette-esque, which I think is a really cool concept here. But then I took the concept of the 2000 VHS releases of the original trilogy, the white versions of those, from like A New Hope and Return of the Jedi, and sort of ran with it to get the second edition covers. But kind of a labor of love, spent a lot of time with it. Basically, I mean, we're talking doing all the pictures, mostly in an Amazon, like Lightbox, photo box type thing, editing those in Photoshop, using Word with a template of the size of the book to put all the text together, insert all the images there, images being inserted mostly using tables without lines, and eventually, creating the cover with templates from CreateSpace / Kindle Direct Publishing there in Photoshop to eventually put it together with their system to get the 3 volumes. I don't want to belabor the point. I try not to hype these constantly on the channel, but what I thought was going to just be, hold it the right way up, what I thought was just going to be an updated version of this essentially became something much larger. It wound up becoming 3 volumes, first of all. The first volume covering basically the live-action films from 1977 up through 2015, so prior to any of the Disney-era films being released on home media. And then Volume 2, continuing with live-action films, picking up with 2016 onward up to the point of publication, which was back in 2021, late 2021. And then Volume 3 for basically everything else. And, I made the judgment call in doing these that I would not include a little checklist like the first edition it had in the back, because there'd be just way too much to put on it. So I am still in the process, even today, of putting together a massive Excel spreadsheet that I would just share online through my site for those who would want to use that to track their own collections. It's not ready yet, but it's getting there. It's further along with each time that I get a chance to work on it here. But there was also the question of Kindle. Ebooks have become a big thing. People asked for a while, could I get an ebook version of the first edition? And doing so at the time, the only options out there would have completely screwed up the formatting. So, by the time the second edition came around, there were more options available. In fact, more options not just in terms of the digital copy, but also physical copies as well. So I wound up going with 3 different versions, which I had not anticipated when starting. I went with a paperback version, which was essentially a color version, kind of like this for each volume, where it was color on the inside, but it was printed on sort of that regular paper. So it didn't have like glossy pages with super crisp images, but still nice images. Then decided to go for sort of a premium version with what wound up coming with volumes like these, where it was hardback with a printed hardback cover, not a dust jacket or anything, and better quality paper for the images, making them even clearer. And then for those who wanted an ebook version, I wound up doing what's basically called a print replica version, where it's essentially a digital file, super crisp, super clean, zoom in, and you're not seeing pixelation or anything like that, just beautiful interior that basically works on the Kindle app or on Kindle devices that can handle print replica, but ironically, not Kindles like mine. I use a Kindle Paperwhite, and the e-ink readers can't use that type of file. But that was I sort of felt like that was sort of a magnum opus for me. Like that was the culmination of many years of work, the culmination of a lot of work and episodes of this show and a lot of the conversation from it. And yet here we are, and there's still more to talk about. You know, there's still more episodes to do. We are almost, but not quite, to episode 500 of this series. Now, granted, we're actually well beyond 500 if you take into account all like the supplemental episodes and stuff like that, but as far as main numbered episodes, we're coming up on 500, just not quite yet. We won't hit 500 by the exact 10th anniversary, which is why I'm going ahead and recording this now and releasing it a matter of days shy of that anniversary to make sure it gets out and I don't get derailed by mowing or work obligations or something else in my little bit of time that I have to record. But it's been just quite a journey, and you can tell that from, you know, what we see in the videos themselves. Like, you could go back and watch the early episodes, and compare them to now, and it's a pretty big difference. I mean, back then, it was me in the apartment dining room area with my Star Wars bookshelves behind me, emphasis on bookshelves, not home video shelves, behind me, recording on a crappy little netbook using its webcam. And then eventually, as far as technology goes, going from that to a separate webcam on a different device that wasn't great, but wasn't terrible, until eventually getting to the point of using a Mac and a different webcam, and now being on the second iteration of using an iPad to do this, where I don't need a separate microphone like the Blue Snowball microphone that I was using for a long time, where it's very seamless. I set up the iPad here just on a tripod on the edge of my desk that ends about here, and after recording, I airdrop it to a MacBook, use iMovie, and then upload to YouTube. It's a much more seamless process now, and the visual quality is much better. I burn up in this office a lot of times because of just the heat of light coming in from the window, the sunlight, plus the overhead lights, but it's a much better setup than it was. As far as location went, I went from that living room recording or dining room recording at the apartment to a spare bedroom that was used basically for storage at the apartment until eventually we moved into this house. But even then, and you saw, I chronicled on video on the channel the building of this Star Wars collection room / office as we moved in. But for a lot of the early episodes, it was Star Wars books still behind me. It really took heading towards sort of the big burst of stuff around, I believe it was the Rise of Skywalker / Skywalker Saga period, where I wound up saying, okay, it's time for this stuff to go. My home video collection is taking up even more and more space. It's time to unload all these books and comics that I'm no longer hanging on to, many of them, there's a few that I kept, and just sell those off so to get money for other things, things, medical bills and upcoming purchases like Skywalker Saga stuff, if I remember correctly. But that then allowed me to start putting the home video stuff in the background, and now it encompasses the entire room to the point where I need probably more space to hold this stuff. Just a constant evolution of the series. And I guess you could say of me, because you've seen me grow grayer. You've seen me lose the goatee. You've seen me gain a little bit of weight. So I'm not the scrawny little guy that I was for pretty much my entire young life. You know, when you hit about 40 and that metabolism slows down, you start to be able to have an easier time finding clothes that fit instead of always having trouble finding smaller clothes. My height is still an issue. It's still sometimes difficult to find like pants that are a 29 length leg, because usually it's 29 or 30 is about as far as it can go for me, because I'm not exactly a tall guy. But it's been a fun experience, and it's just weird to look back over the last 10 years and think of how all of this has evolved. And all the different great people I've met along the way thanks to this series and thanks to this community. I know I couldn't name everyone, but I know there's tons of collectors out there, like-minded collectors that I've had great experiences with, who I maybe never would have met had it not been for something like this. So just know that if we have interacted on a Star Wars home video basis, whether in the group or otherwise, that has been a great thrill for me over these last 10 years. That, as I talked about in the video on the top joys of being a Star Wars home video collector, that is what makes this worthwhile. Yeah, I'm sharing information, and I'm compelled to do that as a teacher all the time. Yes, there's fun in the actual collecting itself, but sharing within that community, sharing that knowledge, having those conversations, being able to talk about new release and just have discussions on something that we're passionate about, that most people find a weird niche of collecting that they would never bother with, that is a really rewarding piece of all of this, and I appreciate all of you for the time spent engaging with me on this stuff. I appreciate that, and the same goes for those who have stuck with me for years. There are people, I am amazed, there are still people that I interact with to this day who know me either from the podcasting days, including the early Chrono Radio podcasting days, back when, there wasn't a website for Star Wars Fan Audio yet, or once I had launched StarWarsFanWorks.com back then, and people who I still engage with from back in the days when the Star Wars Timeline Gold didn't even get called the Star Wars Timeline Gold yet, and it was simply the Star Wars Timeline 1.0, 1.1, and so on. It's been a rare thing in real life to have people that I still engage with from that long ago. We're talking like when I was, a senior in high school. There are some people from high school I still engage with, but not a ton. There are few that I still engage with, if any, from like college era. And yet, here are these people who I still engage with, who are still around, still partaking of the stuff, still engaging, that I have these solid relationships with, as much as you can have, a friendship with someone online, I'm assuming. At this point, 26 years in some cases later, if you're talking about the people who were around for the first edition of the Star Wars Timeline project when I released that Star Wars Timeline 1.0. 26 years is more than half of my life. And yet these folks are still around. So I appreciate you. I appreciate you guys and the community that has been built in these corners where toxicity hopefully has rarely raised its ugly head, as we sort of all stand as bulwarks against that. I know I've talked about that before, so I don't want to dive too much into the rabbit hole of that issue. But my thanks to those who have stuck around for years, and to those who are just discovering it anew, who might now be going back and watching old episodes of this series, or might not have heard of the books until this video, and are now like, I'm going to go check that out. It's been a fun 10 years, and a fun, 26 years, I guess, in the broader scope of working on fandom projects and whatnot. Now, I've been asked repeatedly about my thoughts on the state of Star Wars home video. I don't want to go too much into it now, because I know that questions about this are coming up in an upcoming Q&A episode from the Star Wars home video library, because people have asked those questions. I've seen the questions, I just haven't recorded the episode yet. I may do that today. But the short version is that I do think that Star Wars home video collectors are going to have to shift our focus from collecting forward, collecting new releases, to mostly collecting previously existing items that we just find interesting from sort of the back catalog that is out there. Because Star Wars home video releases have dwindled down to almost nothing. When the trilogy sets came out a while back, the US didn't get any of those at all. We did get new releases this year, but it was just reissues of the original trilogy in steelbooks at Best Buy, specifically for the Disney 100 celebration, not for anything Star Wars related per se. Just happened to be caught in that whole process. We are hearing rumblings from Bob Iger that maybe he'll lean more towards physical media, but at the same time, we are seeing physical media die in some markets. We already saw a consolidation of television networks shutting down to focus entirely on streaming in Asia, or many parts of Asia, from Disney. We also saw Walt Disney Studios Home Entertainment recently announce essentially pulling out of physical new releases at all from the Australian market. Just done. And of course, we've seen the dwindling of the Blu-ray 3D market over time, where you could get it in the US and then you couldn't, and then you could get it in the UK and then you couldn't, and now Japan being one of the only places you can still get Blu-ray 3D discs of new releases through, like say Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 that'll be shipping very soon from Amazon Japan and whatnot. It is a dwindling marketplace. There is always going to be a need for physical media, I would say, or at least local digital copies, downloaded copies, as opposed to streaming-only copies of media, because A, you're going to want that kind of thing for archival purposes, and people are going to want it. B, because there's that physical, tactile sense of owning something if you actually have it. Even if it is a digital file, it's still owning rather than just streaming and being at the mercy of the streaming services. C, there is always going to be an issue when it comes to streaming being the main source of this type of thing when you don't have massive penetration of home broadband. I mean, you have places within the United States where streaming as the primary means of watching movies really isn't as viable as it is in other parts of the country. Broadband penetration just isn't there in some cases, so physical media is the way to get that experience. But just as they are sort of forgotten in the sense of the broadband penetration itself and trying to actually get broadband to those areas, that's also sort of a forgotten market that, generally speaking, I don't think the home video companies really care too much about getting into on their end, right? So, yeah, we don't really care if they get the physical releases. They can stream. Oh, but it's also the same places they didn't really care to get the broadband set up for that area, so they're being kind of double screwed. Not good. And it's just one of those things where I think, time will tell. But the biggest factor is that whole issue of being at the mercy of the streaming services. We've seen digital copies get replaced by updated copies, and the original copies no longer being available, as in the case of the now, in theory, officially non-existent 2015 digital cuts of all of the original 6 films except for A New Hope, which were replaced by the Disney Plus cuts in 2019. 2019. But then we also have the issue of companies now, streaming services now, feeling as though sometimes a series is more of use as a tax write-off if deleted from a streaming service than actually as content for viewers on their streaming services. We have not seen the loss of Star Wars content yet, but we certainly have seen the loss of Willow. Willow was up for a short while after the last episode aired, and then it made more sense to use as a tax write-off and delete it from Disney+. And that's okay if you're doing like Paramount did by removing Star Trek Prodigy, although they really shouldn't have, because at least then there are physical home media releases of the series that are available out there as an alternative, and a buy it once and keep it type of alternative at that. Disney isn't doing that. We are not only seeing a pulling out in regions like Australia, we're also not seeing a willingness so far to put MCU shows, Star Wars shows, all these original programs from Disney Plus onto physical media whatsoever. Again, there's hope that Iger might lean that direction, but there's nothing so far saying it's going to happen. Although I will say there was a bit of a panic for a while there of Manta Lab, outside of the U.S., foreign market, of Manta Lab doing a steelbook, fancy steelbook, Blue Fans-esque release for WandaVision that had no disc, no actual copy of the series in it. Very much like many video game companies now do deluxe editions with steelbooks and all kinds of other goodies, but no actual physical game disc in those either. That, for what it's worth, was not Walt Disney Studios Home Entertainment. That was a company that is a licensee of Disney consumer products who can make mock-up stuff like that and sell it, and somebody along the food chain approved it. But that was not actually part of Walt Disney Studios Home Entertainment, the home video arm of the company. So at least we can hope that the home video arm is not leaning in that direction towards physical things with no actual copies in it. But that still leaves us at a place where there seem to be no physical copies whatsoever being on offer, and no sense of when, if at all, that will happen. And the further we get into the streaming era, the less and less likely the physical media will be considered a viable option for the businesses. The market is there. We can see that through companies like Netflix and Paramount doing physical releases, but Disney, for whatever reason, doesn't see it that way. So at least for right now, we can't count on physical releases of Star Wars shows from Disney+, and we can't really necessarily count on too much in the way of new Star Wars film releases on home media until we actually see new Star Wars films in theaters. Which again means that from a collecting standpoint, there's not a lot of looking forward. A lot of it is going to have to be looking back, picking up stuff in the back catalog. Or, as sort of a side thing within fandom that I don't tend to address much on the show, there is also the issue of bootlegs. Disney has created a situation, an environment, an ecosystem in which bootlegs of their Disney Plus shows proliferate like mad, because it's not like in most cases where it's, oh, a movie's in a theater. Ooh, there's a bootleg available. Yeah, but if I wait like a month or two, there's an official thing where I can actually get bonus features, and it's a really good copy of it, and I'm actually supporting the creators. So screw those bootlegs. I'm going to wait that month or two, or whatever it might be. I'm going to get the real deal. When there is no real deal to get, regardless of how long you wait, the bootlegs will proliferate. They are everywhere. Walmart.com, where they can allow third-party sellers, eBay, Amazon Marketplace, Etsy of all places. Bootlegs are everywhere at this point, and there is no one to blame for the bootlegs other than the bootleggers themselves and the choices of Walt Disney Studios Home Entertainment in not releasing these series, or whoever it is that makes a decision. Maybe it's Disney Plus executives making the decision, but whoever's decision it is to not parlay the success of those series on Disney Plus into physical media. I see that growing. In fact, I see more collectors turning to bootlegs to at least have physical copies of stuff, even if not for collecting purposes, but to have something so that if Disney decides to pull a Willow and simply delete a series, that it's still accessible somehow, even if not through official means. It is a weird period for home media. We have some of the best Star Wars content being produced in years now in the form of some of these Disney Plus series. Great stuff out there. But from a physical media standpoint, we have only the teeniest, tiniest trickle and almost no spark of hope that we are actually ever going to see the twain meet where the streaming stuff comes to physical media. I hold out a little bit of hope, but not much. I am kind of in that, you know what, if they don't release anything, I'm not going to be disappointed because that is what I expect to happen. Can't be disappointed when it's what you expected. On the other hand, if they do release something, I'm going to be excited because I will be pleasantly surprised in that case. I feel like, as someone with high blood pressure who takes medicine for it, I'll live longer when I let myself be less stressed worrying about when certain releases are going to happen. But anyway, a lot of this is going to be stuff I'm sure that I'll hit in those Q&As. I just wanted to sort of wax philosophical for a moment, get on my soapbox, as I think maybe in a 10th anniversary video, maybe is an earned thing. Maybe it's more appropriate here than anywhere else. So here's to another decade of Star Wars home video collecting. Do I expect the series to go for another 10 years? Do I expect there to be another 500 or so episodes? Probably not, because I don't know that there's going to be that much to cover. But for this first almost 500 episodes, 500 plus if you count the supplementals, and for this first 10 years, in a matter of about a week or so, it's been great. I've really enjoyed being a part of this community. I hope I have been of service to the community, of service to fellow collectors and those just curious about this stuff. And I hope that if you have partaken of this series, it has been enjoyable. And I hope that if you have partaken of a saga on home video, you found that particularly worthwhile and worth the financial investment of picking up whatever copies you decided to pick up. Second edition, first edition, digital, paperback, hardback, whatever it might be. That is appreciated as well. And I hope to continue to be of service to this community that I so adore and enjoy being a part of for years to come. So, as always, we will wrap up this episode. Thank you for watching. And as I started saying in the very first episode back in August of 2013, may the Force be with the home video viewers.